again, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second program in our week-long series of Mass Media Week. I'm asked to remind you of not only the remainder of Mass Media Week, but of one other program which is to be held this week, which will be of great interest to anybody who is concerned with public information. Clark Molenhoff, the bureau chief for the Des Moines Register and Tribune in Washington, is scheduled to speak on the topic of campaign financing in the South Ballroom of the Union at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. That is being sponsored by the League of Women Voters and by the University Lectures Committee. Clark Molenhoff on campaign financing, 10 a.m. Thursday in the South Ballroom of the Union. Now to take a look very briefly at the programs still upcoming in Media Week, which we believe you'll enjoy, and we're sure you'll enjoy tonight's program as well. Tomorrow night, same time, same place, so far as I know, although you might keep your eye open. It was announced that we were to be in the sunroom tonight, and then a change was made rather late this afternoon, and we are in Great Hall. But in one or the other, at the same time, tomorrow night, our speaker will be Dick Richter. Dick Richter is the executive producer of the ABC Evening News, which is, of course, the Howard K. Smith, Harry Reisner television newscast. On Thursday night, also at 8 p.m. in the Union, in either the Sunroom or Great Hall, we're going to hear from Professor Jerome Barron of the National Law Center of George Washington University. He's one of the best known and most controversial of the specialists in the field of communication law and access to the media. On Friday night, Dr. and Mrs. Ivan Doig of Seattle, who are authors of a widely circulated book entitled News, A Consumer's Guide, will be our speakers. And they're going to present what they call a do-it-yourself guide for laymen on how to read your newspaper and how to watch your television newscast more intelligently. That talk, which is seeking to wrap up the theme of our entire Mass Media Week, on Friday will be in the gallery up on the second floor of the Union at 8 p.m. Now, to a job that gives me a great deal of pleasure, introducing our speaker tonight. Because as a broadcast newsman of more than 30 years' experience, I've known and admired Bill Monroe, who I assure you is younger than I am. I've known and admired him for a long, long time. I first came to know Bill back in the 1950s, when he was an active and energetic member of the Radio Television News Directors Association, RTNDA. That is the international professional organization in the field of broadcast journalism. His fellow news directors thought of him so highly that it wasn't long before he was elected as the president of RTNDA. At that time, he was the news director of WDSU-TV in New Orleans, one of the finest television news operations in the country. And it was one with the nationwide reputation for its courageous editorial policies, for which Bill was responsible. His station won a Peabody Award and 2 RTNDA awards for news and editorial excellence while he was the news director there. Bill was Phi Beta Kappa at Tulane University in New Orleans. On graduation, began his news career with United Press International in that city. Later spent 4 years in radio news at WNOE New Orleans. Then he was, for 5 years, an associate editor and the chief editorial writer for the New Orleans Item newspaper. After half a dozen very successful years at WDSU-TV, Bill went to NBC as their Washington bureau chief in 1961. In late 1968, he joined the staff of Today, NBC's enormously successful morning television program, and he assumed what has now become a familiar role to many people who watch television, as the perceptive and searching interviewer of leading government officials and executives. Almost anyone of importance who's appeared on the Washington scene in recent years has been interviewed by Bill Monroe on Today. From Agnew to Ted Kennedy, from Goldwater to Nader, from Rockefeller to Reagan, they've all been on the tube and on the grill with Bill Monroe. And if you'll forgive me for saying so, Bill Monroe is more than just a pretty face. He's a highly intelligent, concerned human being with a solid commitment, I happen to know personally, to the very best standards in broadcast journalism, which is today the medium which informs more Americans than any other communications medium. So believe me, it isn't just with pleasure, but with a great deal of genuine pride that I introduce to you Bill Monroe of NBC. Bill?
in connection with that remark about more than just a pretty face, I don't think I will forgive you, Jack. But, the mic's working all right. Am I audible? If not, at any time during the evening, if someone will hold up a hand, I will take that as a sign that I should speak a little louder or do something about the mics. Jack, thank you very much. It's good to be here in Ames, partly because I have a feeling it's good journalism country, and partly on account of being here at the invitation of Jack Shelley. As Jack indicated, we have known each other for a couple of decades at least. I liked Jack immediately because he's likable. I've admired him for a long time, both for his reputation as a man who ran a sharp news operation in Des Moines and for his contributions to the Radio Television News Directors Association, of which he is a past president, and his contributions are most formidable. Of course, I don't have the slightest reason to believe that he's worth a damn as a journalism professor. But I do think those of you who are students of his should know that Jack once, to my knowledge, was a hell of a fellow. And while neither parents nor teachers expect respect from the young anymore, if you would just chuckle at Jack's funny stories every now and then, I would appreciate it. And no matter what he said about my age, I'm about of his vintage, and so if you're going to give him any old geezer courtesy, I'll be happy to take some too. I hope you will excuse me tonight for indulging in the comfort of a text. But I have been in radio and television long enough, as Jack indicated, so that I remember the early days when there were many more fluffs and boners on the air than there are now, and I could never get over the idea that you better be well prepared and be familiar with your text, have a text if possible. I remember one time in New Orleans when at our television station we heard, and other stations and news organizations in New Orleans were getting reports from northern Louisiana to the effect that a man named Fred Preaus was about to run for governor. And this man was an automobile dealer somewhere around Shreveport. And for some reason or other, we had no idea how to pronounce his name. Some of us would, when these stories came in, one of us would put the story on the air and call him Fred Pruse, and somebody would put the story on the air an hour later and call him Fred Prouse, and somebody else would put the story on the next day and call him Fred Pro, which of course was pretty ridiculous. And these stories kept coming in, and we felt we had to do something about this conflict we were having amongst our own newscasters about how to pronounce the name. Now, the sensible thing to do would have been to spend 50 cents on a phone call to Shreveport and find out how to pronounce the man's name, but that may not have been in the news budget. At any rate, we flipped the coin or did something arbitrary, and we decided at least we would all call the man the same thing, and we happened on Fred Pro. And we sounded very good for about a week. We all called him the same thing, so we sounded fairly authoritative. And the other stations in town began to think we knew something they didn't know. They started calling him Fred Pro too, since we seemed to be agreed on it. And it worked very well until one day this man announced he was indeed going to run for governor. He put out his official announcement, and he had a good public relations man who realized that the pronunciation of his name was going to be a problem, and so he very prominently mentioned in the announcement they put out something about how to pronounce the name. And the Associated Press picked this up and put it up high in the story the day the Associated Press put it on the wire. And we had an announcer. In those days, more announcers read news than happens today. Usually they're newsmen reading news today. This announcer, a very golden-voiced type, went on the air without having read over his script, and it had this Associated Press story in it, and his listeners heard him say, he was first did a television newscast, then radio. His listeners heard him say, "Good morning, everyone. There's a new candidate for governor this morning. The new candidate is Fred Pro, whose name rhymes with moose." But this kind of thing may have been just indigenous to Louisiana. When I was a boy, there was a town in Louisiana. There still is a town in Louisiana. At that time, the people there, I can swear, called it Houma. It's spelled H-O-U-M-A, and I think it got its name from the Humus Indians. But over a couple of decades, people started calling it Homer for some reason, which led to a lot of confusion because there's another town in Louisiana, H-O-M-E-R, also pronounced Homer. So anytime you had a story from either of those cities, nobody could quite tell where the story came from. And we finally decided in our newsroom, which had such a novel approach to these problems of pronunciation, that we would do it like this. There was a 5-car accident today in Homer. That's the Houma, not the Homer. At Jack's suggestion, I'd like to start off by telling you a little bit about how the Today Show operates, how decisions are made about what goes on the air and what doesn't, particularly in relation to my own peculiar function as an interviewer. My title is Washington Editor of the Today program. To put it officially, we tend to use that word program when we're being official. As a matter of fact, some of the NBC brass break out in hives if they hear anyone calling it the Today Show. They're embarrassed, I guess, at the implications of the NBC News branch producing something called a show. The only trouble is every one of its 7 million viewers call it the Today Show. And I personally suspect that if, over the years, it had been putting on the kind of material that compelled people to call it a program, or if we could turn thinking around today and get people to accord it the semantic dignity of the word program, 2/3 of its audience would disappear immediately. My feeling is if we can sneak a good program in under the title of show, we're way ahead of the game, never mind the embarrassment. Program is a terrible word. It has a lot in common, I'm reminded tonight, with the word lecture. It may be a little worse than lecture in its promise of interminable education. At least lecture suggests you're going to hear from one person who is certainly going to give out after an hour or so. But program, you don't know what you're getting into. If you're like me, you've been excited many a time at being invited to a dance, a concert, a play, a movie, a game, or a show, but you have yet to experience your first small thrill at being invited to attend a program. And that's why when I'm out of town, out of earshot of my bosses, I just throw caution to the winds and refer to it flat out as the Today Show. In fact, I suggested to Shelley that he bill me tonight as the Bill Monroe Show, with the admittedly sneaky thought that we might get a crowd anticipating a little country music. But Jack has 2 or 3 more scruples than I do. He may be wondering when I'm going to get around to the subject, but I'll have you know I've heard him make speeches when he never did get around to the subject. My actual job may be somewhat more limited than the title Washington Editor suggests. The Today Show is divided into 2 operating sections, which are referred to even in New York, as a matter of fact, as the news side and the show side. The news side has to do with Frank Blair's newscast at 7, 7:30, 8, and 8:30. I have no connection with these, not even with the Washington news contained in them. They are under the jurisdiction of a news editor in New York. He works with the Washington news desk to arrange what stories are to be inserted into Frank's newscast from Washington, what film is to be used, what correspondents will voice them, how long they'll run, etc. I work on the show side, which probably is misnamed because it probably contains much more news material or news-type material than entertainment or strictly feature material, particularly out of Washington. It's my job to suggest to the producer, Stuart Schulberg in New York, and this happens usually on the telephone about 9:30 in the morning, the names of possible Washington news figures to appear as interview guests in the 3 or 4 Washington interview segments each week. Then it's a matter of trying to line up the guest or line up a second or third choice if the first guest turns you down, first choice guest turns you down. Then it's a matter of cramming homework in preparation for the interview. And I often find myself, if I'm not able to get it done by 5:30 or 6 p.m., taking it home and doing it there in the evening. And it reminds me exactly of cramming for a high school exam or for a college exam. This involves reading clippings, articles, background material on the subject of the next day's interview, perhaps making a few phone calls to track down the latest information on some issue. I also work out with the producer or an assistant of his which Washington correspondents will do the 2-minute byline essays usually assigned to Washington during a typical week and on what subjects. Now, you're getting the idea by now that the Today Show is a lot more complicated than what meets the eye. What's visible on television, of course, is sort of the tip of the iceberg. And, of course, a fascinating aspect to doing live interviews with news figures is that no matter what you anticipate, no matter how thorough the homework or how sure you are of what kind of thing a particular politician probably will say, you never know how an interview is going to turn out. And occasionally things happen during an interview, backstage things that might come under the category of non-event, which nevertheless make an interview starkly memorable to the interviewer, even though the happening might not be visible on the air at all to the person watching at home. For example, I did an interview one morning in Washington with Senator Muskie some months before the Democratic Convention of 1972. And this was at a time when the senator, God help him, still was the alleged front runner for the Democratic nomination. And the interview was going fine until I noticed the floor director, who was standing behind Muskie. Muskie was sort of facing me. I was looking toward him. And the floor director behind Muskie, whom Muskie could not see, was holding up a cue card for me to take a look at. Now, I had seen this floor director a few seconds earlier scribbling something on this cue card in greased pencil. And I figured that, as occasionally happens, Stuart Schulberg in New York had some question for Muskie in his mind that he wasn't sure was on my mind, and he wanted to suggest that question to me. So while Muskie was answering a question, I glanced at the cue card. It said, "Hills of the Party." Hills of the Party. What the dickens did that mean? Didn't make any sense. I tossed it around in my mind frantically while Muskie went on with his answer, and I decided I was not about to figure it out. I thought I'd better let the floor director know, or whoever was sending him such a cryptic message, probably Stuart, that I didn't get it. So I shrugged my shoulders in a gesture of helplessness and non-comprehension. Senator Muskie, who had been talking amiably into the camera, turned to look at me and caught me in the middle of my shrug of despair. He stopped cold in mid-sentence, apparently seized by the thought that I was making some sour commentary to someone off camera on what he was saying. I thought to myself, my God, he can't stop now. I don't have the least idea what he's been saying for the past 50 seconds. And I don't have another question at the tip of my tongue. Fortunately, Muskie decided he was just witnessing a bit of television business that didn't concern him directly, and he started up again to complete his answer. The floor director, at whom I had directed my eloquent shrug, was not much help. He shrugged his shoulders back at me, as if to say, if you don't know what it means, how the hell do I know what it means? Then it occurred to me that I shouldn't be too arrogant to know-it-all about those words on the cue card. They didn't make sense to me, but after all, Washington correspondents don't know everything. On some days, we don't even get a chance to read Art Buchwald. So maybe, I said to myself, I should be a little humble and figure that the producer might know something I didn't know. Why does one always have to understand the question? Just ask it. Senator Muskie, what about the hills of the party? And sit back and hope for the best. But Muskie is not a dependable guy to do this kind of thing with. There's a perverse streak of honesty in Muskie. Some politicians, I assure you, could make a nice little speech for you at the drop of a hat about the hills of the party. But Muskie would be likely to look puzzled for a moment and then say, what do you mean, the hills of the party? At which point I would have to start talking to the producer right there on camera. Yeah, what do you mean, the hills of the party? And that's something you don't like to do even in desperate live television. Finally, it occurred to me that there just had to be some slight tricky phonetic problem with those words, and it came to me that the H was not supposed to be there. The subject was the ills of the Democratic Party, its troubles, debt and disunity and so forth. So I asked Senator Muskie about that, and he said in 500 well-chosen but unprophetic words that everything was going to be just fine. Sometimes, though, I wish I had asked Senator Muskie about the hills of the party. It's not often you can find a real, genuine, surprise question for a presidential candidate, and there I had one. I keep wondering whether Muskie would have invented some hills right there under the straight-faced pressure of the question. I keep thinking we missed a possibly classic little 30 or 60-second scene there that we could have used later in gag reels. As it was, all the viewer noticed was that Muskie stopped talking for 5 seconds and looked off to his right with a startled expression at something off camera, then recovered and got going again. What kind of news values, what kind of judgments go into choosing senators, congressmen, and cabinet members to appear on the Today Show? And when I say choosing, as I think I've indicated earlier, I don't mean to suggest we get all the people we ask for. We do not. Often they're too busy, have an important breakfast they have to attend, plan to go out of town, or just turn us down for reasons we're left to wonder about. And at the same time, sometimes they will travel across the country and stay up all night to appear on the Today Show if they have something they want to say or something, or they think the appearance will do them some political good. With a little persistence, if we do not get the person we want this week, we'll try to keep after him and line him up for next week or next month. I happen to keep a messy desk. It has papers, magazines, memos, letters, background stuff, books, clippings, etc., piled up on every square inch to a height approaching 1 foot in some places. Every now and then, when some element of the mess starts humping up and getting hilly, sloping instead of lying flat, and starts sliding off onto the floor, I have to undertake a remedial cleanup, at least in that section of the desk. But one element I try to keep in order is a clipboard containing notes on possible interviews we might do in the next few days and weeks. There's a single sheet on top outlining all of the active interview possibilities. Then below that, there are various related papers expanding on the possible subjects, clippings, letters, publicity material, memos from the producer, but mostly notes to myself on phone calls from various people who are suggesting guests to us. Typically, one of these might be a phone call from the press assistant to a senator saying that his boss has an important bill coming to the floor next Wednesday and would be available for an interview on the subject. Let me be specific about the decision-making we have to do, the problems and complexities of it, by going over with you for a few minutes the cover sheet which I had on my clipboard this past Thursday, 5 days ago, having to do with interview possibilities for the next day, Friday, that is about 4 days ago, and the next week, that is this week and beyond. There were 2 broad categories of names on the list, as there usually are. A group of people, in effect, seeking to get on the Today program or Today show, people whose offices typically telephoned me or Molly Sharp, who works with me in Washington on the Today show, to let us know that they had a bill or an idea to push, something they wanted to say, if we had interview time available for that person and that subject. And a second group of names put on the list on our own initiative because they're in the news or because they look like good interview prospects for one reason or another. And before I go into this list, I might mention one thing. The key thought in trying to line up interview subjects, the first thought that we usually consider is this: is there a big piece of news running, something that is leading newscasts and taking up major front page space all over the country? If so, is there a Washington figure right in the middle of that story whom we have not had on in the last week, whom we can get on the air tomorrow morning while the story is still hot to explain something about what's going on, perhaps to make some news himself? The name of the program is Today. So can we get somebody worth listening to tell us what he knows, give us his view or her view of news that is big in this morning's papers and this morning's newscasts, the basics of which you heard on the Today show, ideally from Frank Blair just a few minutes before the interview itself. And to try to work this way, we seldom arrange for interviews more than 1 or 2 days before they're to take place. And most of the time, we're calling somebody on Tuesday to ask if he or she will be on the show the next morning, Wednesday. And sometimes we're calling someone Tuesday night to ask about their coming on the next morning, just a few hours later. Yesterday morning, after we got through one interview, we began making arrangements for this morning's interview, and we went to our first choice, Senator Hughes of Iowa, about his desertion of politics for religion. We were not dealing in this case with today's news because this happened a little more than a week ago. He announced that he was leaving politics to go into religion full time. But we had not gotten to Senator Hughes since he made that announcement. We were involved with other things, and we did not want to pass by this sort of character study of an unusual man. And there's something you can do on television, and I think maybe we had some success at it this morning with Senator Hughes. A lot of the interest in what is this, a senator becoming a full-time religious worker? That's odd. It certainly doesn't happen every day. Is this man sincere? Is he an oddball? Well, I think from watching a man on television, you can get a feeling of him that you can't get even in a first-class newspaper interview. The newspaper can do some things we can't do, and we can do some things they can't do. And I think you could not watch, my guess is that you could not watch Senator Hughes this morning without realizing that he may think differently from you or me, but this man is a profoundly religious man with considerable eloquence about the depth of his religious beliefs, and you came away from the interview realizing what an unusual man this was and what an honest, decent, God-fearing Christian kind of guy he was. one of the things that can happen in an interview for what it's worth, and I think it's often worth something. At any rate, here's what the list of prospects looked like for the Today Show in Washington as of Thursday. And I'll start out with those names where staff people had called to say that their bosses or somebody they were connected with might be available, a practice, by the way, I look on as wholly legitimate and often very helpful to us. The first names, until I indicate to the contrary, are people more or less offered to the program. Senator Ribicoff on heating oil. His committee is hearing witnesses and releasing a study showing there is enough heating oil for the Northeast this winter if the administration imposes mandatory controls. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, James Lynn. He will be available for an interview after the President sends his housing message to Congress, which was originally expected on Wednesday of last week, but that is now being delayed from this week to next, apparently because there's some division about it within the administration, or it needs to go to some additional people for study. It's an interesting question in itself, why the delay? The National Association of Home Builders, they would like to put their president on the program to suggest steps to make more mortgage money available and save the industry from a possible recession, the way they look at it. John Gardner of Common Cause, available to push their campaign for public financing of federal election campaigns. De'Armey Bailey, one of the black radicals whom we interviewed 2 years ago after they were elected to the Berkeley, California City Council. Bailey was recently thrown out in a recall election. He's willing to talk about that and about blacks in politics. Peter Goldmark, a scientist formerly with CBS, about to visit Washington, interested in solar energy, rural development, and his plan for a government satellite to broadcast entertainment and cultural television programs. This is an oddity. We don't often get people calling us and saying, this important scientist would be available for you next week. Some kind of promotion here. Goldmark's got some kind of business going, I guess, or something he's particularly interested in. Scientists can be passionate like everybody else, like politicians, and some idea he wants to push. Congressman Pettis of California, he's pushing a bill to save some prehistoric Indian rock carvings in the Mojave Desert from vandalism. Some good pictures of the carvings are available. Admiral Jean Larocque, an articulate, well-informed, retired admiral connected with a pro-disarmament group who is willing to argue for cuts in the defense budget. Meat industry spokesman. The meat industry is holding a Monday news conference to announce a new nationwide plan for standardized labeling and names for all meat cuts. They're willing to preview their own press conference Monday morning on the Today Show. Senator Abourezk, his amendment comes up Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday to deny foreign aid that goes for the support of imprisonment or torture of political prisoners. This would affect such countries as Greece, Brazil, and Vietnam, whose police training systems we support with foreign aid, at least to an extent. In addition to those approximately 10 names of people whose officers had told us of their availability, we had 10 other prospects on our list that we had put there on our own. Senator Hugh Scott. 2 weeks ago, we began trying to get interviews with Senator Mansfield, the Democratic leader, and Senator Scott, the Republican leader, to talk about the new session of Congress. Senator Mansfield finally agreed to an interview, which took place last Monday. Senator Scott has been turning us down, but his office suggests we should keep trying. William Colby, new head of the CIA. His office says he is not averse to an interview, but he will not do one for a few months at least until he gets more familiar with his job. Clarence Kelly, the new head of the FBI. His office is also encouraging, suggesting he will soon be accepting interview invitations. John Connally, he's on a tour tending his presidential hopes. He almost always provides a lively interview, but we've had him on several times in the past year, and maybe it would be overdoing it to ask him again at this time. Connally happens to be a guy I like to interview. It's fun to interview Connally because he comes on like gangbusters. He's got tremendous confidence in what he says. He's fairly candid. He's likely to tell you some things you wouldn't expect him to say if he was being very careful about what he's saying. He's exuberant, and he sort of enjoys the duel with newsmen. You're trying to get something out of him, maybe trying to get him to say something that you think he believes but doesn't want to say. He's trying to say what he wants to say, and he enjoys it. Senator Hughes, quitting the Senate to become a full-time religious worker. John Love, formerly governor of Colorado, now the new energy czar. Topic all phases of the energy crisis, beginning with the currently hot subject of whether mandatory fuel oil allocation is needed. Congresswoman Heckler, she has a bill to provide equality for women in the field of credit. Stuart Schulberg would like to have her on the program soon, but there's no particular angle that makes it necessary in the next few days. Russell Train, the new head of the Environmental Protection Agency, we could talk to him about environmental issues in general and specifically about his own stand in favor of mandatory heating oil allocation to try to minimize, the way he looks at it, relaxation of the clean air standards. Congressman Ullman of Oregon, with Wilbur Mills now having serious back trouble and talking about quitting, Ullman may succeed him as chairman of Ways and Means and suddenly become one of the nation's powerful political figures. Chief topic, should there be a tax increase to combat inflation? Senator Jackson, or one or two of the witnesses expected before his committee next week. This will begin in a day or so. Topic, stock manipulations and hanky-panky on Wall Street. Out of the names on that list, our first choice for an interview Friday, the day after this list was in effect, was John Love, the be a key man to talk about what is perhaps the liveliest current issue in Washington. Should there be mandatory allocation, aside from the Watergate tapes, I should say, I guess, should there be mandatory allocation of heating oil to prevent shortages this winter, especially in the Northeast and in parts of the Midwest? Mr. Love turned us down, said he couldn't do it last week. Next, we turned to Russell Train, also in a vital new job, also connected with the hot issues of environment and energy, also willing to talk about mandatory controls from his point of view, which happens to be different from Love's. In addition, there was a special element of timeliness about Train because he had been confirmed for his new job by the Senate a few days before and was scheduled to be formally sworn in on Friday, the very day of the interview. Train accepted and appeared on the show on Friday. For Monday, that is yesterday morning, we asked David Stroud. This in a way is perhaps an unlikely choice from what I've told you earlier. We asked David Stroud, the meat industry spokesman, to be with us, which he did. He was our first choice for Monday because, again, there was keen timeliness. He was set to have a news conference in Washington later that same morning. Usually, people holding news conferences are not willing to be interviewed beforehand on the Today Show or by anyone else, thus giving one news organization an exclusive preview, a sort of scoop of their own scheduled news conference. But Mr. Stroud was willing. The subject, in a way, was not of monumental importance. It was more a women's page story than a front page story, but it had to have a definite interest to a tremendous section of our audience, housewives and grocery shoppers. In addition, we were not confined to talking about the main subject of their announcement, the new meat labeling process. We could also ask Mr. Stroud about meat prices. Will they ever come down? Another element in the Stroud interview that interested us was that it was something different. Too many Washington interviews about the Alaskan pipeline, Watergate, inflation, and so forth get you into a rut. Variety spices up life not only for the audience, but for us on the program. And if we do some things now and then, partly because we think they're fun or anticipate some fun from them, or that they're novel or offbeat, our own interest has got to communicate itself to the audience to some extent. In the case of the meat labeling interview, I told Stuart Schulberg on the phone as we contemplated it, the obvious, that I don't know hoof from mouth when it comes to meat cuts. He said, why don't you get your wife to come on the program with you as a resident expert? So I asked her about it that night, and though she was terrified, never having been on television before, she contributed yesterday morning to a shopper's knowledge to the interview and added a sort of element of novelty and human warmth. I did another offbeat interview a couple of months ago with Mrs. Rogers Morton, the wife of the Secretary of the Interior. She had been on a trip to Alaska, and we talked about a subject that she is interested in, preservation of wolves. We had a domesticated wolf appear with us during the interview, a great big yellow-eyed brute. It lay down at my feet, and I had to lean over and pet it for the whole 10-minute interview while talking to Mrs. Morton over my shoulder. I had to pet it because the wolf got restless if you stopped petting it. And while it was perfectly amiable, had I ceased my massaging, it might have gotten up and played tug-of-war with me on the other end of the leash or demanded more attention in some unpredictable wolf-like manner. Just before the interview, as we were sitting in the chairs on the set in the studio, this wolf had come up to me and opened its mouth and clamped it down on my wrist. And it was a fairly gentle embrace, but I didn't know what his intentions were. And I decided it wouldn't make sense to kick him, to scream, or to jerk my hand away, so as you're supposed to do in the case of a holdup, I let him have it. And after about 30 seconds, he got bored with it and let it go. But mostly the Washington interviews run along the lines I've indicated, say with former Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg about the legal issue of the presidential tapes, or with the Watergate Committee senators, or with Secretary of Agriculture Butts about food prices, or Melvin Laird, the man who took John Ehrlichman's job, about the post-Watergate scene inside the White House. We look for subjects and people that are timely, in the news, important, or if not of major importance, at least interesting to a major segment of the audience, or sometimes just something that intrigues us. And we guess it might intrigue much of the audience if it intrigues us, just because it's something fresh and novel, a change of pace. We keep an eye out for fairness and balance. If we have interviewed Mike Mansfield, we try to keep going after his counterpart, Senator Scott, until we get him. If the House is debating a bill to limit the president's war powers, we'll try to have both sides on together, Congressman Bradamus for the bill and Congressman Ford against. Well, that's a glimpse of how we operate. I suppose there are questions that could be asked about balance, about whether bias enters into the decisions. And I suppose a certain amount of individuality, personal judgment, or preference does enter in. That would have to be true for any news product, print or electronic, where choices have to be made and editing has to be done. But I believe the whole process, so far as I've observed it and participated in it, and this is certainly a self-serving statement, is tempered with some professionalism and a consistent effort at least to be fair and even-handed. Now, for a few minutes, I'd like to shift gears to some extent and talk about news judgments on a different level and who is entitled to make them, the whole business of media and freedom and where news comes from in a democracy. In the long run, even if I have not convinced you by describing one operation within one news-oriented program that the networks in general ought to be trusted, and there's no particular reason why you should develop a trust in the networks on the basis of the partial evidence I provided tonight, didn't really intend that, and even if you're conscious at the same time of some abuses and deficiencies in local television news, I'd like to suggest to you that independent news decisions made by independent editors remain just as vital to the future of this country as they did the day the First Amendment was written. Not because such decisions are made perfectly today or likely to be made with consistent wisdom in the future, but because it seems to me there is only one long-run alternative to independent news decisions, and that is government news decisions. And this, by the way, and much of what I'm about to say, those of you who plan to be here a couple of nights hence when I believe Jerome Barron will be on this program will find that much of what I am saying is in sharp contrast to what you will hear from Mr. Barron. I'm arguing against FCC and interference in news decisions. Mr. Barron has some very good points and some criticism against the media, some of which makes me wince. He's very right about some of the critical things he says, but his solution to some of his problems is to have the government come in and exert more influence on the media. And I see the media getting more intimidated by government every time someone tries to do good by having the government prod the media in any particular directions. It seems to me that partly for accidental reasons of history, we have been moving toward government decisions in the field of broadcast news. But I believe we're beginning to see how dangerous that trend is or where it's taking us, and I think we can turn it around and move toward the same solid First Amendment freedom for television and radio that we still cherish for the printed press. The basic problem of press freedom for our generation, I believe, is the fact that the American government never had much of a chance to get hold of the American press until now. Now it does have a chance, and it is, in fact, using that chance to gain some leverage over the press. This opportunity for government to move in has developed because the press has changed shape. The radio station and television station have joined the local newspaper in dispensing both news and comic strips, if you will, to the community. In addition to the front page, we now also have a newscast. Alongside Dick Tracy, we have Flip Wilson and jolly disc jockeys. But this new form of press, broadcasting, is not specifically identified in the First Amendment. The Founding Fathers had no way to anticipate 20th century technology. So the First Amendment forbids Congress to abridge freedom of the press, a word referring to the technology of print. On top of that, you've got to have somebody allocate broadcast licenses to keep multiple traffic off the same frequencies. So the different technology of this new form of press and the license problem give the politicians a feeling that they can move in on electronic journalism and tell it how to play the news. Uncle Sam Ervin has said that there can be no doubt the framers of the Constitution would have included broadcasting in the First Amendment by name if they had possessed a crystal ball. The important thing, he points out, is not the technology, but the function the medium serves, and broadcasting performs the very function designed to be protected by the First Amendment. So broadcasting, in Senator Ervin's view, is clearly press within the meaning of the First Amendment and should have its full protection. Some other people, such as Justice Douglas, are beginning to agree with Mr. Sam. But we have built a regulatory structure over the years that virtually strips broadcasting of genuine First Amendment protection. And most of the regulatory structure that does this, going back some decades, was put together not by the Nixon administration and the vice president, but by those happiest of regulators, the Democratic liberals. It started out in the early days of radio, only about 50 years ago, when the new medium looked more like an entertainment box in the home than it did like a source of news. So to be fair to those early regulators, the news function, the First Amendment function, was not very visible when they began their work. But even after the news function has become highly visible, the regulators have continued tying government strings on broadcasting, largely because politicians have always been willing to move in and get some influence over, some control over the media if they could do it. It's all happened so gradually in relation to broadcasting that we've sort of grown up with it, gotten used to it, been brainwashed by it, without recognizing something important, that we have fashioned a powerful news and information process for the first time in American history which is accountable to the government. We have, in effect, eroded the First Amendment. As a young reporter, I once heard a newspaper city editor end a telephone argument with a politically powerful city councilman by telling him to go to hell. Then the editor hung up. I don't want to recommend that kind of blow-your-stack tactic to anyone, and I was a little aghast at how the city editor had handled himself. But there was something in the conversation that impressed me as a young reporter. That newspaper man had a deep sense of security about his independence from government. And I had the feeling at the time that his sense of security probably served his readers well. Broadcasters do not have that strong a sense of security. The broadcaster must apply to a government body every 3 years for the right to stay in business, and special interests are increasingly challenging station licenses for their own purposes. The broadcaster, in certain decisions on political coverage, has to go beyond his own journalistic judgment to consider the attitudes of a government commission. The newspaper publisher does not. For example, if NBC carries live in prime time Senator George McGovern's announcement of Sergeant Shriver to replace Senator Eagleton on the Democratic ticket, will the FCC agree that it's legitimate news, or will the FCC call it an equal time problem? So here we have newsmen having to worry about what a government agency might think before they make a news judgment. Whatever happened to the First Amendment? If a documentary stirs up some angry letters, let's say from 120 viewers and one or two congressmen, with some of them fired off to the FCC, the broadcaster may get a letter from a government commission directing him to explain and justify the program within 10 or 20 days. Last time I checked, the FCC was sending out about 200 such letters every year. And the station manager who gets one may tell his documentary producer, please to do a couple of travelogues before tackling another controversial subject. Not that he's intimidated exactly, he just doesn't enjoy the experience of being harassed by the government more than once a year. Newspaper publishers don't have that experience. Fred Freed, who produces some of NBC's best documentaries and who produced that 3-hour spectacular on the energy problem a couple of weeks ago, once said that if you do something controversial, you know you will spend months defending yourself to the government. That's not conducive to doing something controversial. The broadcaster is forbidden by law to present a debate among major candidates unless the vegetarian and pot liquor party candidates are included. Now, this is a law, the simple effect of which is to prevent debates. It does not serve the public interest. You know whose interest it serves. It serves the interest of the very politicians who passed the law. They were protecting themselves because sometimes the incumbents in particular would prefer not to have to debate. These are, it seems to me, chilling effects, the kind of inhibiting factors the First Amendment is supposed to protect journalism from. These factors may make a station manager, if he's simply human, feel that he needs every friend he can find inside the government. And he may just wind up less eager than a newspaper publisher to expose wrongdoing in Washington or even in a governor's office. There are signs that today's young people who grew up in what is to me the polluted atmosphere of overregulated electronic media put more emphasis on the idea of fair press than on the idea of free press. They may, or perhaps I should say you may, change your minds when you discover that fair press can't be guaranteed because there's only one entity that can even try to impose fairness on the press, and that, of course, is the government. And government-guaranteed fairness is likely to wind up becoming fairness toward the government, which slowly becomes kindness toward the government, which may drift into complete subservience to the government. An assured fair press, in other words, has to come at the expense of free press and is likely to wind up in a different and more ominous kind of unfairness than you started out with. A University of Texas journalism teacher recently asked this question in a survey: should there be a law against slanting the news? This, of course, is precisely what the First Amendment forbids. Of newsmen answering the question, 2.5% answered yes. Of legislators answering the question, 30% said yes. Of teachers, 38% said yes. Of the general public, 52% said yes. And of students, 71% said yes, there should be a law against slanting the news. Now, that suggests to me that the basic idea of press freedom in this country, not just for broadcasting as a matter of fact, but for newspapers as well, is losing ground. As for regulation of broadcasting, it seems to me that despite all the myths and all the acceptance that have evolved around the kind of regulation we now have, for lack of challenge to it, basically, the kind that gives American politicians their first weapons against American journalists, there is no necessity for us to continue to put up with such an anti-First Amendment process. There is a form of minimal regulation possible which is compatible with the First Amendment, and there's no reason why we could not start moving toward it. It would involve allocating station licenses on a permanent basis, licenses in perpetuity. Permanent licenses could be granted originally by the same process as we have now for granting licenses. Licenses now held could perhaps be made permanent, or licenses could be awarded by lottery, or they could be auctioned off to the highest bidders. But once granted, each broadcasting company would operate indefinitely on its assigned frequency, subject only to the technical requirement that it keep its signal on that frequency. At that point, the United States would have a fully free press, print and electronic. The government would be out of broadcast program content out of editorial comment, and the First Amendment would once again be restored and healthy, applicable to all media. And broadcasting would then not, it seems to me, become irresponsible, as some would have it, because it would remain, like the newspapers, amenable to the disciplines of competition, the trials of the marketplace, and the necessity of public acceptance for a mass medium. John Chancellor, for example, has no tendencies that I'm aware of toward radical or extreme journalism, but if he did, he and NBC are not likely to indulge any such tendencies in view of the viewer's ability and the advertiser's ability to go to Cronkite or to Smith Reasoner or to the many local television newscasts. And those television newscasts rely, by the way, largely on AP and UPI for national and international news, and these local newscasts have a larger sum total of audience by far than the network newscasts do. Licenses in perpetuity at the moment, I must admit, represents an unorthodox, almost a radical point of view. But we're just beginning to think about what we're doing to broadcasting and putting it under the thumb of government. And such diverse folk as former Senator Gene McCarthy and the conservative economist Milton Friedman have put the idea forward. Meanwhile, short of that, we would be going toward free electronic media if we start dropping the present doctrines of government interference, such as government rules and government refereeing of fairness, such as the so-called equal time laws that prevent debates between presidential candidates. All of the cliche arguments against genuine application of the First Amendment to broadcasting, of course, come to mind. Anybody can start a newspaper, not anybody can start a television station. The public owns the airwaves. Television stations make too much money. Some stations might abuse their freedom. The networks are too powerful. I wish I had time now, but I don't, to analyze what seem to me well-worn but empty articles of faith. If you can shake loose the habit of accepting them, they do not stand up under challenge. What I'm arguing for is a restoration of the First Amendment to what it used to be, but is not anymore, a solid wall between all media and the government. There is no other genuine security for broadcasting, no other way of guaranteeing the American people that they will continue to get the independent information they need to keep control of a swelling executive branch that is increasingly inclined to manipulate information. It seems to me that if Watergate has left all of us with a certain healthy distrust of government, a basic sort of suspicion similar to that shared by the men who wrote the Bill of Rights, we may yet make the First Amendment whole again and count some blessings from this disaster of political corruption and meanness. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, very much. Bill will entertain questions. I'll call your attention, as was the case last night, to the fact that there are 3 microphones in the hall. They're probably going to require a little adjustment depending on your physical dimensions. But do we have somebody who wants to ask some questions? Those of you who are familiar with the fairness doctrine of the Federal Communications Commission, of the equal time provisions of the communications law and so forth, will recognize that Bill Monroe has indeed uttered some very provocative thoughts during particularly the latter half of his talk this evening. Anybody want to raise some questions? Yes. Bill, why don't you just go ahead and field them?
Mr. Monroe, is it working?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm interested if federal control were taking off the broadcast media, would that not present a financial problem to the networks and to the broadcasters? How would, say, a television news special fare against first-run films like Love Story, and would we see a lessening of news broadcasts as opposed to really popular programs, either situation comedies or of that nature?
The question is, could you hear the question? The question is whether if government controls were removed, there would not be a financial problem to the networks in terms of mounting documentaries and news programs which don't do well in the ratings by comparison with entertainment programs. I don't think there would be any difference. The networks suffer financial problems now from putting these programs on, and they would suffer financial problems if government controls were removed. We might take up another aspect of that question, which sometimes comes up, and that is whether networks and local stations would be willing to put some of these money-losing programs on if the government were not, in effect, prodding them to do so. My answer is, I think so. I don't think most of the programs now put on are put on in response to government prodding. You see, we have an odd situation where the government prodding, which is supposed to make networks and local stations do good, doesn't really have to come out that way, because if a station wants to get by, they can put on a cheap, no-good, superficial documentary and put it on at 10 o'clock Saturday morning and get exactly the same points that another station that might put twice as much money into the program, twice as much care and thought, and put it on in prime time. Station B might lose $30,000. Station A has lost $5,000. They get the same amount of brownie points from the Federal Communications Commission. So I don't think the money-losing programs that are now put on that we would lose if we had government controls taken off. In connection with questions, if you want to ask some questions that are totally irrelevant to anything I said, feel free to do that. Yeah.
This morning's Washington Post came out with an article about the possibility that Spiro Agnew would be retiring before the week is out. These attributions on these articles left a little bit to be desired in that, you know, they were anonymous sources, and then it was denied by anonymous sources in the White House. Do you have any reaction to these stories and possibly any insight that you might have from your Washington
I don't have
experience?
any personal knowledge of what the Vice President's plans might be. I do have some reactions to the story. I'm inclined to think that there is some considerable possibility that the Vice President might resign. I'm inclined to think that he has been considering resigning and talking to people about it, even if he hasn't made his mind up, on the basis of David Broder's story. David Broder is one of the most careful and one of the most nonpartisan journalists in Washington, one of the most respected. It was only a couple of weeks ago he had a column in the Washington Post in which he chided his own newspaper for a point of view he felt was wrong. It had to do with the matter of whether the fact that the Vice President was under investigation should have been leaked in the first place. Should this have come out in the open? And many journalists, including the Washington Post, in its official editorial policy, have taken the position that it's a shame that the government sources leaked this because it is kind of unfair to the Vice President. But if we get such a leak from sources we know to be reliable, we must print it, because we're not supposed to hold news back. And sometimes it's useful to print such things on the basis that if the government might have some tendency to whitewash an ongoing investigation, it's going to be a lot harder to do it if the public knows the investigation is going on. At the same time, Broder felt that there was some unfairness to the Vice President here, and he was not satisfied with this explanation, and he raised the question, shouldn't the Washington Post, shouldn't all of us newsmen have some responsibility? Should we really put this kind of thing into print just because it's leaked to us and because it comes from sources we trust? Is this fair? Does it undermine the judicial process? So Broder is a pretty independent kind of guy, and some of his stories in the past have been cited with considerable pleasure by the White House because he's often taken a viewpoint favorable to the administration or to the President. He's not the kind of journalist that's trying to hatchet the Vice President. Now, he did a very careful story, and he checked with a number of sources, most of whom he could not name. It depends to a large extent on whether you trust David Broder. I trust Broder, and I feel that you have to credit his story with at least the meaning that the Vice President has been thinking about resigning, and one person he has talked to is convinced that he's just about made his mind up. And I think if Broder has a story from somebody that he knows to be important, and my experience is with a journalist of the integrity of Broder, if he quotes a high administration source, it is probably a very high administration source. Usually, journalists like Broder don't exaggerate their sources. Sometimes, if he says a source within the State Department, which he did not in this case, it often turns out to be the Secretary of State himself. Usually, in the case of well-known and respected journalists, the source is almost a little better than he's indicating. He would like to be able to tell you who it is, but he can't. And I don't think we ought to be in the position of withholding what is genuine news in general. I'm not sure about Broder's case about the leaks about the Vice President being investigated. That worries me too. But in general, I don't think newsmen should be in the position of withholding material which their readers and viewers and listeners would like to hear, which are interesting to the American public, because of some judgment that we have that maybe it would be a little unfair. If we get into this boat, a lot of people in our audience will begin to feel that we're a little cozy with government. We're trying to protect the vice president. We're trying to protect Senator so-and-so, and we're too cozy with our sources. And we like to tell people that when we get news, we print it or we put it on the air, and generally this is the case. And we'll have problems if we start withholding news. So I would defend Broder's story and give you my guess that it's legitimate. Yeah. If we went to permanent licensing of broadcasters, how would I ensure that the licensees would be fair to all sides on controversial subjects? I wouldn't. You would be in the same position, and this is perhaps the weakest point of my argument, but I don't think it's very weak. It is a free press argument. There is no guarantee today that the Des Moines Register or the Des Moines Tribune is going to be fair to all sides. Those newspapers are perfectly within their rights to attack somebody or print a story that some politician might look on as vicious and refuse to print the other side. Now, you're in trouble if you do that very much, because there are other media. Now, you've got a monopoly newspaper situation here, 2 newspapers and 1 ownership. You've got less monopoly, actually, in the television field. But you can go get your news from one of the local television stations if you don't trust the Des Moines papers. And if a television station starts a pattern of unfairness to any group in the community, they can go to another television station and get their news. And the only guarantee we have against unfairness is this multimedia system and the fact that if you don't trust one medium, you can go to another. And there would be stations who would probably abuse their responsibilities and their freedom, and I have to admit that. And we have newspapers today which abuse their responsibilities. I think the one in New Hampshire that attacked Senator Muskie, and some aspects of the attack seemed to me obviously unfair, is a newspaper in whose community I would find it difficult to live. I would suffer a little if I had to live there and that was the only newspaper I could read in that community. But it is so important to keep the government from getting a hold on that newspaper and your newspaper and the one in Chicago, as it is beginning to do on television stations, that we put up with these abuses and with these problems and deficiencies for the sake of preventing the government from gradually becoming the one voice that influences and dominates what we hear from all media. Yeah. This lady's got a darn good argument.